Welcome back, wanderer. The night has come once more. The world outside is quiet. The fires of the day have settled into embers, and the long, slow hours of darkness lie open before you. There is nothing you must do tonight, nothing you must remember, nothing you must hold. There is only this, the voice, the story, and the long, gentle drift into sleep. Take a slow breath in and let it out slowly. Let your body sink gently into the place where you rest. Let your hands grow still. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day fall away from you like leaves in late autumn, drifting down to the forest floor. Tonight, we come to the last of our tales of the Old Norse. We have walked together, you and I, through the deep beginnings of their world. We have stood in the void of Ginnungagap, where the ice met the fire and the first giant was born. We have followed Odin to the well, where he gave up his eye, and to the tree where he hung for 9 nights. We have stood beside Thor as he raised Mjolnir, as he traveled to Utgard, as he pulled the great serpent from the deep. We have walked into the dark forests of Ironwood, where Loki's monstrous children grew. We have seen the wolf bound by a ribbon, the serpent cast into the encircling sea, the half-living queen take her throne in the realm of the dead. These have been long stories, strange stories, and sometimes dark stories. But tonight, we come to the darkest of them all. Tonight, we come to the end of all things. The Norse called it Ragnarok. It meant the doom of the gods, the twilight of the powers, the final fire that would consume the world tree and everything that grew upon it. This was not a story the Vikings whispered with hope. They did not believe their gods would win in the end. They did not believe that good would triumph and evil would be defeated. The Old Norse had a darker vision. They believed that everything they loved, every god they worshipped, every hero they sang of, every bright hall and golden tree, all of it would fall. All of it would burn. And that somehow this was as it should be. This was the shape of the world. This was the price of all the long ages of life and beauty that had come before. But the Old Norse also believed something else. They believed that after the burning, after the ending, after the great silence, something new would rise. A new world, a new dawn, a new beginning. That, too, is part of our tale tonight. Let us begin, then, with the signs. For Ragnarok did not arrive without warning. The end of the world was prophesied long before it came. The seers of the 9 realms had foretold it. Odin himself, with the wisdom he had bought at the well of Mimir, had seen it. The Norns had woven it into the fates of all things, even the gods themselves. And so, when the signs began to come, those who knew the old prophecies looked at one another, and they nodded slowly, and they said, "It is beginning." The first sign was the death of Baldur. Baldur, the most beloved of all the gods, the shining son of Odin and Frigg, the bright god whose presence brought warmth, whose laughter brought joy, whose very skin glowed with a soft and gentle light. All things in the 9 worlds had sworn an oath not to harm him. All things, save one, a small plant called mistletoe, which Frigg, in her great love, had thought too young, too harmless to bother with. And it was mistletoe in the end that killed him. A spear made of mistletoe wood, fired by the blind god Hod, guided in secret by the trickster Loki. When Baldur fell, the world fell with him. The light dimmed, the gods wept. The earth itself seemed to grow colder. And those who knew the prophecies understood. This was the first crack in the order of things, the first sign that the end was coming. Loki, as you may remember, was bound for this deed, bound in his cave beneath the dripping serpent. But binding cannot last forever, and the venom that dripped on him over the long ages did not break him. It forged him. He grew angrier in his cave. He grew darker. He waited. And while Loki waited, the world above began to change. The second sign was the breaking of the old bonds. In the time before the end, the Norse said, families would turn against families. Brothers would fight brothers and not stop until both were dead. Fathers would slay their sons. Sons would slay their fathers. The old laws of kinship, the deepest laws, the ones that had held human society together since the first humans walked Midgard, would crack. Friends would betray friends. Lovers would betray lovers. Oaths would be broken. Promises would mean nothing. The very bonds that made civilization possible would unravel thread by thread in the years before the end. This was a terrifying prophecy to the Old Norse, for they were a people who valued kinship above all things. To them, your family was your identity. Your tribe was your protection. Your oaths were your soul. To imagine a time when these things would fall apart, when blood would mean nothing, when promises would be lies, this was as terrible to them as the burning of the sky. The third sign was the Great Winter. It was called the Fimbul Winter, the Mighty Winter, the Winter of Winters. When it came, summer would not return. 3 winters would pass in a row, with no warm season between them. 3 years of snow that did not melt. 3 years of ice that grew thicker. 3 years of darkness and cold and frozen earth and crops that would not grow. Imagine such a thing. Imagine winter upon winter upon winter, with no relief. The crops fail, the animals die, the rivers freeze solid. The villages of Midgard struggle to survive, then begin to fall. The strong take from the weak because they must. The weak die in their cold halls, their fires extinguished, their children silent. The wolves grow bold and walk through the streets of empty villages. The land itself begins to die. This was the Fimbul Winter, 3 years that no living thing could endure, 3 years that the prophecies said would empty the world of half its life before the true ending even began. And during this great winter, the cosmos itself would begin to fail. The 2 great wolves who had chased the sun and moon since the beginning of the world, Skoll and Hati, would finally catch their prey. Skoll would run down the sun, Hati would seize the moon, they would devour them both. the sky would go black, the stars would tremble in their places, and many of them, the old stories say, would simply fall. The world in those last days would be a place of darkness, no sun, no moon, only the long winter and the cracking of bonds and the slow gathering of all the forces that would, at last, bring the end. And then, at last, the prophecy would speak its final word. The bonds would break. Breathe slowly, in and out. Let the image rest gently in your mind, the world growing dim, the sun and moon devoured, the endless winter falling. These are dark images, but they are also old. They have been told for 1,000 years. They have rested in the minds of countless listeners. They are stories now, gentle as bedtime tales. Let them carry you as they carried so many others into the slow drift of sleep. In a deep cave far below the earth, the great wolf Fenrir had lain bound for centuries. Bound by the soft ribbon Gleipnir, made of impossible things, the sound of a cat's footfall, the breath of a fish, the roots of a mountain. The dwarves had woven these things into a single binding, and the binding had held the wolf for longer than any creature had been bound before. But Gleipnir was not eternal. Nothing is eternal in the old Norse tales. Even the bonds of the gods, even the chains of magic, even the deepest of gaze, all of these things have their time. And the time of Gleipnir was running out. The wolf had grown, even in his binding. His body was vaster now than when the gods had first cast him into the cave. His shoulders pressed against the walls, his jaws, fixed open by the great sword the gods had thrust through them, dripped with the saliva of his rage. The river Van, the river of his fury, formed by the constant flow of that saliva, ran out of the cave and across the world, and where it touched, things died. And then, in the last days, came the moment the wolf had waited for. The Fimbul winter ended, the sun was devoured, the world fell into darkness. And Gleipnir, holding the wolf for so long, finally snapped. It happened slowly at first. A single thread of the impossible ribbon gave way, then another, then another. Fenrir felt it, the lightening of his bonds, the coming freedom. He pulled with the strength of an age of imprisonment. And Gleipnir burst. The pieces flew across the cave. The great sword fell from his jaws and clattered to the stone. Fenrir rose slowly, his body unfolding from its long crouch. He stretched his great shoulders. He shook out his fur. He was free. And his first thought, after 1,000 years of waiting, was of one being. Not Tyr, who had given his hand. Not the dwarves who had made the ribbon. No. Fenrir thought of Odin, the All-Father, the king of the gods, the one who had given the order, the one who had chosen to bind him. And Fenrir began immediately to climb up out of the cave, to find his way to Asgard, to finish what had been written into his fate from the moment he was born. In the encircling sea around Midgard, Jormungandr stirred. The great serpent had lain in the deep for ages. His vast body, biting its own tail, had encircled the world for so long that the mortals above had forgotten he existed. They thought of him only in old songs, in fragments of prophecies, in the warnings of seers. But he had been there all along, patient, waiting. When the bonds broke, when the very order of the world began to fail, Jormungandr felt it. He felt the cracking of the cosmos like a vibration along his great length. He felt the time of his waking, and he opened his ancient eyes. He loosed his tail. The world shook. The encircling sea, which had lain calm and dark above his coils for 10,000 years, suddenly heaved. Great waves rose. Tidal walls of water roared toward the shores of Midgard, toward the lands of mortals, toward the harbors and the cities. Whole islands disappeared beneath the rising waters. Whole peoples vanished in a single afternoon. And from the deepest depths, rising at last, came the serpent itself. His head broke the surface, vast and terrible, eyes like cold suns. His coiled body, longer than any mountain range, longer than any river, longer than the whole length of Midgard from end to end, surged through the water. He breathed, and the air filled with poison. The rivers turned black. The fish died in their schools and floated, white-bellied, to the surface. The birds, breathing the venomous mist, fell from the sky. Jormungandr was free. And in his deep cave, Loki, bound for so long beneath the dripping serpent, watched over by his faithful Sigyn, felt the world above him changing. He had felt the wolf break free. He had felt the serpent rise. And now, at last, he felt his own bonds beginning to fail. The cords that bound him, once the entrails of his murdered son, hardened into iron, began to crack. The great stones beneath him groaned. The serpent above stopped its dripping, suddenly still, sensing that something was changing. Sigyn looked at her husband. The bowl in her hands trembled. She had held it for so long, so many ages, so many countless years of silence and patience and love. Loki met her eyes. She did not weep. She did not speak. She simply set down the bowl slowly, and she stepped back. The bonds shattered. Loki rose. The serpent above him fled into the dark. Loki was free. He stretched. He looked at his hands, gnarled now, blackened by centuries of venom. He looked at his wife, who had stayed beside him through everything. And then he turned, and he walked out of the cave, and he did not look back. In the cold realm of Helheim, deep beneath the roots of the World Tree, the Queen Hel rose from her throne. She had received the dead for 10,000 years, the sick, the aged, the drowned, the fallen, generation after generation, war upon war, plague upon plague. They had come to her, all of them, and she had received them, and she had given them their place in her great hall, and they had remained. But now, at last, the time had come. Hel walked among her armies. The shades of the dead, who had stood silent in her halls for so long, raised their heads. They formed ranks. they stretched out their pale hands, and from somewhere, from places no living being could see, weapons came to fill them. Swords of mist, spears of shadow, bows of bone. The dead are many. The dead in the old Norse stories are more numerous than the stars. And on this day, all of them, in their countless legions, would march. Hel looked upon them. Her half-living face was unchanged. Her half-dead face was unchanged. But there was, perhaps, the faintest curl of a smile at the living corner of her mouth. It was time. She raised her hand, and the dead began to move. Breathe slowly. In and out. 3 bonds had broken. The wolf was loose. The serpent was rising. The dead were marching. And in his cave, the trickster Loki had stepped, free, into the darkening world. The end had begun. Far to the south, in the realm of Muspelheim, where the fires had burned since the beginning of the world, the great guardian Surt had been waiting. Surt, the fire giant, the being who had stood at the borders of the flame realm since before there was an earth or a sky, whose flaming sword, said the old prophecies, was brighter than the sun itself. He had watched for all these long ages. He had watched the worlds rise. He had watched the gods build their golden halls. He had watched Yggdrasil grow and the 9 realms branch out from its mighty trunk. He had watched humankind walk across Midgard and live and love and die. He had watched it all, and he had waited. For he knew his role. He had always known. When the time came, when the bonds broke, when the wolves devoured the sun and moon, Surt would lead the armies of fire out of Muspelheim. He would cross the rainbow bridge into Asgard, and he would burn the world. The time had come. Surt raised his great sword. The blade caught the dying light of a burning sky and turned it into something brighter. Behind him, a vast host of fire giants, beings of flame and ash, beings born in the eternal forges of Muspelheim, rose at his command. They stretched out across the plains of fire, an army that no mortal eye had ever imagined. Surt began to march. He led his armies north, across the burning plains, across the borders of Muspelheim, across the desolate lands that lay between the realms. They came at last to Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, the shining arc of light that connected Asgard to the other realms, the bridge that had stood since the gods had first built their citadel, watched over by the watchman Heimdall. Surt set foot upon Bifrost, and the bridge, which had endured every storm, every winter, every age of the world, began to crack beneath his weight. The colors of the rainbow flickered, the light dimmed. Surt walked on, and the fire giants walked behind him, and the beautiful bridge of the gods began to shatter. At the gates of Asgard, Heimdall raised his great horn. Heimdall, the watchman, the god who saw 100 leagues in every direction, the god who needed no sleep, the god who could hear grass growing on the earth and wool growing on the backs of sheep. He had stood at this post since the beginning of all things. He had waited for this moment. Now, with the fire giants approaching on the broken bridge, with the wolf running across the world, with the serpent rising from the sea, with the dead marching from below, Heimdall lifted Gjallarhorn to his lips, and he blew. The sound of Gjallarhorn was a sound that had never before been heard in any of the 9 worlds. It was the sound of warning. It was the sound of summons. It was the sound that meant, at last, the end had come. It rolled across Asgard. It rolled across Midgard. It rolled down through the roots of Yggdrasil to Helheim. It rolled out across the encircling sea. Every being in every realm heard it and knew what it meant. In Asgard, the gods gathered. Odin rose from his high throne. He had known this day would come. He had seen it in the well of Mimir long ago. He had carried the weight of this knowledge for 10,000 years. Now, at last, it was here. He took up his spear, Gungnir. He set the 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, to his ride. He called for his armies, the chosen warriors who had fallen in battle through all the ages, who had feasted with him in Valhalla, who had been preparing all this time for exactly this day. The 540 doors of Valhalla opened, and from each door 800 warriors poured out. Generation upon generation of fallen heroes, the bravest dead from every age of the world. They stretched out across the plains of Asgard, an army that no enemy had ever faced. They had been waiting all this time for Odin to need them. Now he did. Thor came forth, hammer in hand. His red beard was alight with the fire of the moment. He knew his fate. The prophecies had told him long ago that today he would meet Jormungandr, his ancient enemy, the great serpent of the deep. He knew what would come of that meeting. He went toward it anyway. Tyr came forth, his stump of a hand strapped to a great shield, his sword in his good hand. He had paid his price long ago when he placed his hand in a wolf's mouth. He would face another wolf today, Garm, the hound of Helheim, and they would slay each other. He had known this for centuries. He came forward without fear. Frey, the bright god of the harvest, came forth. He had given up his sword long ago in exchange for the love of a giantess. He fought today with the antler of a stag. He too knew his fate. He would fall to Surt, the fire giant. He came forward anyway. Vidar, the silent god, son of Odin, came forth. He spoke little, but he was strong. He wore a great shoe made of all the leather scraps that mortals had ever discarded. The shoe was for one purpose, to hold open the jaws of a wolf. His task today would be vengeance for his father. And many others came. Heimdall, leaving his post, sword drawn, his old enemy Loki riding toward him from across the broken bridge. Vali, Modi, Magni, Ul, the Aesir, all of them, gathered for their last great battle. The forces met on a great field. Vigrid, the prophecies called it, the plain of battle, a field 100 leagues by 100 leagues, wide enough for what was to come. On one side stood the gods and the heroic dead and the bright Aesir of Asgard. On the other stood the wolf, the serpent, the fire giants, the legions of Helheim, the trickster Loki at their head, and Surt with his burning sword. the greatest battle ever fought, and the last battle was about to begin. Breathe slowly, in and out. Let the image settle. Two great armies ranged across an endless plain, the sky burning above them, the earth shaking below, the very air thick with what is to come. No story in all the old tales was greater than this one. No moment in all the long history of the gods was more profound. Rest now gently before the battle begins. The Battle of Vigrid did not begin as one great clash. It began as 1,000 smaller clashes, pairings, old enemies, finding each other across the field, walking toward their long prophesied meetings. The first great pairing was Odin and Fenrir. The All-Father rode out across the plain on his 8-legged horse. He carried Gungnir, the spear that never missed its mark. He wore the helmet of gold that he had worn since the dawn of the world. His one eye burned with the fire of all his ages of wisdom. He had known this moment was coming since he had first looked into the well of Mimir. He had known how it would end. Fenrir saw him coming. The great wolf had grown still vaster in his freedom. His shoulders rose now higher than the tallest tree. His jaws stretched wide enough to touch the ground when he opened them. The upper jaw reached up to the sky. The lower jaw scraped the earth. He waited. Odin charged. He drove Sleipnir forward across the broken plain. He raised Gungnir. He threw the spear with all the strength of the king of gods. The spear flew true. It struck the wolf, and it bit deep. But it did not stop him. Fenrir leapt. He came down upon Odin in a single great motion. His jaws, those vast prophesied jaws, closed over the All-Father. And in one terrible moment, Odin was gone. The king of the gods, the wisest of all the Aesir, the one-eyed wanderer who had given so much, sacrificed so much, learned so much over so many long ages, devoured by a wolf the size of a mountain, as the prophecies had foretold 10,000 years before. But the prophecy did not end there. For Vidar, Odin's silent son, had been waiting. He had worn his great shoe for this moment. Now he stepped forward, and he placed that shoe upon Fenrir's lower jaw. He gripped the wolf's upper jaw with his hand, and he pulled. Fenrir was vast. Fenrir was terrible. Fenrir was the wolf that had devoured the king of gods. But Vidar was the silent strength of the Aesir. He pulled, and the wolf's jaws came apart. Vidar tore the wolf in two. Odin was avenged. Odin was still gone. Across the field, Thor met his ancient enemy. Jormungandr had risen from the sea, and he had crossed the broken plain, and he had come at last to the place of the final battle. He was faster than he had been when Thor had pulled him from the deep all those long ages ago. He was more terrible. He was ancient now, in a way no living being had been before. But Thor was Thor. He had not changed. The god of thunder strode forward, hammer in hand. He raised Mjolnir. he struck. The blow fell upon the serpent's head with such force that the very mountains far away shattered. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled across the world. Jormungandr fell. The great serpent, who had encircled Midgard for 10,000 years, who had bitten his own tail through every long age of the world, Jormungandr was dead. Thor stood victorious over his fallen enemy. But the prophecy did not end there. For Jormungandr had breathed in his dying upon the god of thunder. He had breathed out the venom that had been brewing in his fangs since the beginning of his great life, the poison of the deep. Thor staggered backward. He took one step, two. He had defeated his enemy. He had done what was needed. But the venom was already in his lungs. 3 steps, 4, 5, 6 steps, 7, 8. On the 9th step, the protector of gods and humans, the wielder of Mjolnir, the friend of mankind, fell. And he did not rise again. Heimdall met Loki at the center of the field. The two of them had been enemies for as long as either of them could remember. Heimdall, the watchman, who had always seen Loki for what he was. Loki, the trickster, who had always resented being seen. Now they faced one another with drawn weapons. They fought hard. Each of them knew the prophecy. Each of them knew how this would end. And in the end, as the prophecy had foretold, they killed each other. Heimdall fell upon his sword, and Loki fell upon Heimdall's blade. The two of them lay side by side on the broken plain, their eyes wide and empty, their old quarrel finished at last. Tyr, the one-handed god of justice, met Garm, the hound of Helheim. Garm was a great dog, almost as terrible as his cousin Fenrir, and he had been the guardian of Hel's realm for all the long ages. They fought, they tore at each other, they struck and struck. And in the end, both lay dead, as the prophecy had foretold. Frey met Surt, the bright god of the harvest, fighting with only the antler of a stag, the fire giant, with his sword brighter than the sun. Frey fought bravely. He fought as well as any god has ever fought. But he had given up his sword long ago for love, and Surt's blade was the brightest blade in the cosmos. Frey fell. Surt walked on. And so it went, across the great field of Vigrid, pairing after pairing, old enemies finding each other, each of them fighting their last fight, each of them, in the end, falling. The gods fell, the giants fell, the dead fell, the fire giants fell. The plain became a field of bodies, the sky was choked with smoke and blood and ash. The earth itself drank deep of all that fell. And at the very end, Surt stood alone. The fire giant, who had waited since the beginning of the world for this moment, the one whose sword was brighter than the sun. He looked upon the broken field. He looked upon the dying gods. He looked upon the ruined cosmos. And then he raised his great sword, and he held it high, and he spoke a single word. The word released the fire. It came from his sword. It came from his eyes. It came from the very heart of Muspelheim, far away. It rose, and it consumed everything. The plain of Vigrid burned, Asgard burned, Midgard burned, Jotunheim burned, Vanaheim burned. Yggdrasil itself, the world tree, the axis of all existence, the pillar that held the 9 realms together, Yggdrasil caught fire. Its great branches were swallowed by flame. Its roots, deep beneath the earth, became channels of burning. The tree, which had stood since before time, began to fall. The sky cracked, the earth split, the encircling sea boiled. The 9 worlds, one by one, were consumed. And then, at last, when there was nothing left to burn, even the fire died. A vast silence fell across what had been the cosmos, a silence deeper than any that had ever existed before. The world was gone, the gods were gone, the giants were gone, even the great enemies, Fenrir, Jormungandr, Surt himself, all were gone. Nothing remained. Nothing. Breathe slowly. In and out. Let the image settle, the dark, silent emptiness where a world once was, the great quiet after the great noise. This was the end, as the old Norse believed it would come, as they had told it, by firelight, for 1,000 years. But the story, surprisingly, is not yet over. One last chapter remains. After the silence, something stirred. It was slow at first, so slow that it could barely be called movement. A breath, a faint warming, a slight loosening of the great cold that had followed the great fire. But it was something, and in the long dark of the aftertime, something was a beginning. Where the seas had been, the waters slowly settled. Where the lands had been, the ash slowly cooled. Where the sky had been, a faint pale light, the first light of a new sun, began to grow. For the old prophecies had said this too. They had said that after the burning, after the ending, after the long silence, a new world would rise. A green world, a young world, a world made fresh from the ashes of the old. And so it came to pass. A new earth rose slowly from the depths of the great sea. It rose green, it rose fertile. The grass came first, soft and bright, spreading across the new soil. Then trees, small at first, but growing fast, as young things do. Then flowers, then the first small animals, walking shyly into the new fields. Then the great rivers, running clear, their waters sweet. The new world was beautiful, more beautiful perhaps than the old world had been in its last bitter years. A new sun rose. The old sun had been devoured by the wolf skull, but the old sun had had a daughter, born just before the end, hidden away by her mother. The daughter rose now into the new sky. She was as bright as her mother had been. She was, the old story said, even brighter. She would light the new world. She would warm it. She would shine day after day, just as her mother had once shone. The world would have light again. And from the realm of Helheim, where the dead had dwelled for 10,000 years, 2 figures emerged, blinking into the new light. The first was Balder, the shining god, the most beloved of the Aesir, the one whose death in his ancient time had been the first sign of the end. Hel had kept him in her halls for all the long ages. He had lain there, sleeping, his light dimmed, his laughter silent. But now, with the old world gone and the new one rising, Baldur rose with it. His skin began to glow once more. His eyes opened. He took his first breath of the fresh new air. He smiled. The second was Hod, his brother, the blind god, the unwitting hand of Loki, who had fired the spear of mistletoe so long ago. Hod, too, had dwelled in Helheim. He, too, rose now. Whatever guilt or grief he had carried in the underworld, it was washed away in the new dawn. He stood beside his brother. They embraced. They wept, perhaps, with the joy of seeing each other again after so very long apart. And they walked together into the new world. They were not alone, the old prophecies said. Some of the younger gods had survived the burning. Vidar, who had slain Fenrir. Vali, who had been a child of vengeance. Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, who carried their father's hammer between them. For Mjolnir had survived even the great fire. These young gods walked the new world. They sat together in the place where Asgard had once stood, and they spoke of what had come before. They remembered their fallen fathers. They told the stories. And they began slowly to build a new realm, a simpler one, a quieter one, but theirs. And in the deep groves of the new world, where the trees had grown thickest and the grass was greenest, two more figures stirred. A man and a woman. They had survived the burning. They had hidden in the boughs of an ancient tree, deep within a sacred grove called Hodmimir's Holt. The old tree had protected them. Its branches had spread above them like a roof of leaves, and a fire had passed by without touching them. They were the only humans left in the world. Their names were Lif and Lifthrasir, and they meant life and one who strives after life. They emerged now from the grove, blinking in the new light. The world before them was strange and beautiful, empty of the old peoples, but full of new green things. They held each other's hands. They began to walk. From them, the prophecies said, all of humankind would be born again. They would have children. Their children would have children. And in time, in countless generations, the new world would be peopled, just as the old one had been. A new race of humans, walking under a new sun, telling perhaps their own new stories around their own new fires. Stories that would, perhaps, one day be told again. Maybe, who knows, these very stories. Maybe somewhere in the new world, in some new firelit hall, a voice would tell again the tale of Odin and his eye, of Thor and his hammer, of Loki and his children, and the long war that ended in fire. And listeners would gather to hear, as people have always gathered in every age to hear the old stories told. And so the world began again. This is how the Norse imagined the deepest cycle of all things. A world born from fire and ice, a world that grew and aged and made its gods and made its heroes, a world that came eventually to its end, a world that burned. And then, out of the burning, a new world, quieter, younger, greener, beginning again. There is comfort in this story, perhaps. There is comfort in knowing that even endings are not always final, that even after the longest silence, something stirs, that even after the deepest dark, a new sun rises. The old Norse believed this. Through all their hard winters, through all their long nights, through all their losses, they believed this. You have traveled far tonight, wanderer. You have stood at the breaking of the bonds. You have watched the great wolf rise from his cave. You have seen the serpent loose its tail. You have walked across the plain of Vigrid and witnessed the falling of the gods. You have seen the world burn. And then, at the end, you have seen it begin again. These are old stories, older than anyone alive, older than any country you have ever heard of. They have been told and told and told again for 1,000 years. And tonight, here, quietly, in the small hour of your own life, you have heard them too. You have added yourself to the long chain of listeners that stretches back into the deep past. And perhaps, in some way, you have helped to keep them alive. Now, let it all soften. Let the bright fire of Surt's sword fade to embers. Let the green of the new world grow soft and dim. Let the stories slip down gently into the place where stories rest when they are not being told. The night is yours now, wanderer. The world endures, and so do you. Sleep well. Until the next tale. Until then, rest well.